So welcome everyone. It is a pleasure to be here. We have from all the 24, you see some of them, Alison Christians from the University of McGill, Arulofsson from Personal Capacity, working at the Minister of Finance in the Netherlands, Scott Wilkie from Canada, Joachim English from Germany, Peter Hongler from Switzerland, Marlene Parker from Jamaica, Noam from Hong Kong, Martin de Wilde from the Netherlands, Suranjali from India, Abdul from South Center, Jan van Streek from Leiden University, and we also have Natalia Quiñones from Colombia, Alex Cobham. I'm just putting like the people I see, Taxation Network, and we have Steve Shea from Boston, and we do have Sebastian from the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Job Schent for the Minister of Foreign Affairs here in the Netherlands. And everyone is in their personal capacity, so please notice that. So welcome everyone. So here are the three statements. The idea is we are going to focus not so much on the rate, but you may also say something about the rate because, for instance, there is some work being done now with the Oecd also regarding what is a tax rate. So these two of the statements, the roundtable participants already know, but the third one has been added today. So the first one is, it is in developing countries' best interest to relinquish control over its fiscal policy and to adopt a minimum tax. And then after we have another statement where you can react whether you agree or disagree, some tax incentives with an administrative regulatory framework that guarantees transparency and accountability should be maintained in the minimum tax proposal. Pillar 2 should be modified to assure that the host country will gain revenue irrespective of the extent to which countries implement the income inclusion rule. So I will perhaps give first the word to Scott, because we are working on some of the statements, and then after I will give the word to Suranjali, and then after I will give the word to Steve, and then after I will give the word to everyone. Just please keep in mind that more or less 3 minutes for when you react to the statement. And we will take the statements out of this page, and then after we will put it in the chat for everyone. Please, Scott. Scott, you are mute.
Yeah. I'm sorry about that. Okay. Still forget. Irma, thanks very much for organizing this, and in particular for inviting me. The three questions that you've posed for this discussion, and I won't speak for very long because because I'm sure many others have things to say about this. But the three questions that you posed, which all center in one way or another around the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 proposals, and the most recent re-exposition, if I can put it that way, of them in the Made in America tax plan and the US proposal for minimum tax. In one way or another, all affect or target or influence or in some way or another impinge on the questions that are more closely identified in other areas with so-called sovereignty or fiscal independence of countries, recognizing that countries are unique in terms of their fiscal priorities, the manner in which their citizens through the political process, their social and welfare systems decide to assure each other's circumstances and other elements of their nationhood. And there seems to be embedded within the proposal that there be a global minimum tax at a high rate, the effect that countries would lose the capacity through their tax systems to enable their fiscal policy, or at least they would be significantly affected. And by that, I mean the ability to use the tax system through tax expenditures to encourage investment, to sponsor particular kinds of economic activities, to deliver social programs of various kinds to their citizens, and otherwise to operate within the ambit of their own priorities. An effect of the minimum tax effectively is to bring is truly enough to bring all countries up to a minimum level of income tax, assuming that they rely upon corporate income tax in order to fund their fiscal priorities, which isn't necessarily a correct assumption across all countries. But at the same time, in the expectation that whatever happens within those countries is expected to be taxed in a positive or affirmative way, the capacity of those countries to essentially spend their future tax revenues through tax expenditures of one kind or another in order to sponsor their own development, it seems to me is affected. Particularly in the case of mobile businesses, which I would put in the category of all businesses except extractive industry businesses, which have a necessary presence in particular countries, and maybe installation projects and other kinds of businesses. The effect of a minimum tax proposal may well be to migrate the activities that would otherwise occur in host countries back to the home countries. If it becomes a matter of indifference,
I think,
then,
Scott,
yes,
if you just perhaps say that one final thing so that I can give the comment to Suranjali.
Yeah, sure. I didn't mean to get lost. I think that the question that countries need to ask themselves is whether or not, by agreeing to a minimum tax globally, the effect will cause the migration to home countries of activities that might otherwise occur in the host countries, because it will become a matter of indifference where the tax is paid. Yeah. And the home countries may well then prefer that outcome because the effect is to stop internation revenue transfer through foreign tax recognition mechanism.
Thank you so much. I think that there is two main elements of whether the minimum tax will result in the migration of to other countries, and this case will be the home countries. And I think that also the discussion on tax incentives brings this as well, because the question is, and we see that normally we say, if of course there is the discussion on tax incentives, whether they are bad or good, whether there is the economy efficiency cost, but the question is, do we really think that by having a minimum tax and having all tax incentives in this term of the minimum tax, or the tax incentive will have this specific tax rate, will this mean then that all the, first of all, what it means for the foreign investor, will still be involved in investing in that country? And the second of all is, what does it mean for a developing country? Because I do believe that developing countries need incentives. It is not possible still to get out of the incentives. So that's the reason why there should be more administrative transparency, accountability. So I perhaps will give a word to Suranjali on that one.
Thank you so much, Emma. You raised a very valid question of, how do you look at incentives after such proposals are put in place? So I'll raise a lot of questions. I know that there are experts sitting here today at the roundtable, so they might perhaps shed some light on some of the questions that I will raise too. So in my view, the problem at hand for the US and the OECD is that there is visibly a handful of countries or jurisdictions that have remained out of the reach of initiatives such as the Action Point 1, which was to address the harmful tax practices, as well as, in the preparation of grey lists, which have unfailingly thinned on finalization. The Made in America plan, and forgive me for saying this, but sounds like a Made for America plan. It seeks the end use of such jurisdictions by US-based MNCs and some foreign corporations, as I read the US document. I think the reading is plain that US wants to make amends of its own tax reforms that were undertaken over the last few years and wants to reverse this. Now, the standard approach or thinking is that if you lower tax rates, it sort of pushes up investment, pushes up employment or output, and really did not come out quite clearly in the case of US. But the other thing to think of is that if you look at the numbers, there was a decline in foreign income after the implementation of GILTI and FDII, but it remained constant in terms of GDP, which means there were some companies that were still using this as an opportunity. Now, when we say that the tax rate will ratchet up now in the US, what is left to be thought about is that, is the effect symmetric or will it be asymmetric? As in to say that will raising the tax rate have the same impact as lowering of a tax rate is imagined to have on output. Putting that aside, bringing it back to the developing country perspective, over the last couple of years, the statutory corporate tax rates have hovered between 20 to 25%. I think the bulk of the tax rates. And I think the question that we are now addressing is that what is harmful tax competition and where should this acceptable rate be? And I know that Irma, you say that we shouldn't focus on the rate, but I think at some point, this is going to be the heart of the problem, because your rate is, the effective rate is the result of treaty provisions, your statutory rates and domestic. And I think the related question to ask is, how do we define incentives in this new system? Is it to say that bilaterally the option of negotiating certain rates of withholding are now to be set right? Is it that the developed countries can now sort of interfere with these bilaterally negotiated relations? And for a country like India, where there has been efforts to sort of ratchet up the tax rates, remove incentives, we already have an effective tax rate of 26.7% for large corporates. The question is, what is the gain? In terms of incentives, I would say that my own work for developing countries such as India shows that the impact of incentives is not as strong on output and investment, but I do not rule out the need for these from time to time.
Yeah.
If you look at developing countries, they have other regulatory controls like capital controls or interest subvention. In that case, tax remains the only sort of tool available to them to sort of intervene and impact investment and output. In fact, if you read the US report on the American tax plan, there is a sentence which alludes to repealing the FDII to give incentives for R&D. So incentives are always at the back of the mind of the government. And I think this issue of sovereignty shall remain important. And I think the last thing that I want to talk about is the design of the Pillar 2. It gives the primacy to the ultimate parent entity or the authority there. And so that first right is there. And so therefore, my question is, what is the power of the developing countries to collect? So if there's an incentive offered by a developing country, is it that that incentive is then collected by developed countries to their advantage? Would a measure like SHIELD translate into more aggressive transfer pricing practices in developing countries?
Yeah.
So I think these are the thoughts that I have from the perspective of a developing country. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Suranjali. And then we go to the US part and Steve for the third statement. And then after I will open to everyone. So please raise your hand and feel free. I know Alison is jumping to discuss. So I will give the word to Steve, and then after I will give the word to everyone. Yeah, Steve.
Thank you, Irma, and thank you for allowing me to participate. Just to be clear, I don't have, I'm from the US, but as said at the beginning, this is all in a personal capacity. Is it in a developing country's best interest to relinquish control over its fiscal policy and adopt a minimum tax? The way I view that question today is, should a developing country be supportive of the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 as they seem to be evolving, or does it prefer a failure of that effort, perhaps in the hope that something else would come along that's better? And I think for developing countries, so I'm not wearing my US hat, I'm acting as if I were advising a developing country. I think it's a very close question. When you look at the revenue effects of Pillar 2, and I'll focus primarily on Pillar 2 because Pillar 1 is so inchoate and unclear at this point. The revenue effects are very beneficial for the capital exporting countries, for developed countries. They have a relatively minimal effect for low-income countries as reflected in the OECD's own document. So the net gain under their analysis is not clear, or it's very modest. Nonetheless, and most of that gain comes derivatively in that the idea of their analysis is, with the minimum tax, low-income countries that have rates below the minimum rate could increase their rates, and would not have to give incentives, at least incentives below the minimum rate. And so they would benefit indirectly. It's the crumbs off the table approach. And so the question is that really better than current? And that's not clear to me. Some countries have adopted DSTs. They're very clunky, they're inefficient, they don't raise that much revenue. So I don't think that's a great panacea in the alternative. I come out very, very slightly positive for developing countries. I think part of it's just the reality. This is going to happen. If it's going to happen, I think the question then is how to make the best of it. That brings me to the second question. The second question is some tax incentives within a regulatory framework that tries to keep them rational should be maintained in a minimum tax proposal. Incentives under the minimum tax proposal won't make sense unless there's a carve out for them. So I think implicitly, the question is saying there would need to be a carve out. I am not generally wearing my hat as advisor to the US or wearing my hat as advisor to developing countries a big fan of incentives. But I acknowledge in certain strategic instances, they may be valuable. So it would be very challenging, but perhaps possible to draft a carve out that would achieve the objectives that are implicit in the second question. So once again, I find it a very close question, and it really would depend on how narrowly drafted the carve out was. Nothing would prevent a country from providing incentives in relation to income that's above the minimum rate. So that remains under any scenario. So I don't view that as raised by the second question. The third question is one I actually worked on, and that is, should Pillar 2 be configured in a way that developing countries could, and particularly host countries, by which I think I was meaning largely developing countries, could increase revenue without regard to the level of take-up by countries adopting income inclusion measures. That seems to me to be a clear yes for developing countries. I think I don't understand why, admitting that there are important technical issues to be worked through, the undertax payment rule and the subject to tax rule should not be generally available to developing countries, whether or not Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 are adopted in the first place. And even if they are adopted, why they shouldn't stack first, which would give the revenue to the host country. I have to say I haven't fully worked that through, so I'm raising that as a hypothesis for all the good minds here to continue. Thank you, Irma.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you so much for these comments. It was more to also provocative comments and to start with the discussion. So now we have Natalia Quiñones. She was also presenting, discussing on the subject to tax at the OECD January meeting this year. And then after we have Noam, and then after we have Arnulfsson, and thereafter I will have Barton. Okay, Natalia, please go ahead.
Thank you, Irma, for this very interesting roundtable and for the invitation as well. I just want to bring one up to the discussion, and it has to do with a general objective of all countries. We all want business to be present in our territories. And the way we obtain the presence of business is by offering incentives for them to come and establish their headquarters here. The difference between developed countries and developing countries is that we can't offer most of the advantages that they already have built in, such as free education for the children of the executives, fantastic infrastructure for transporting goods and services, general security and safety, and a rule of law, I guess, in some countries. So developing countries generally are at a disadvantage historically due to many historical factors when it comes to attracting investment into their territories. So what they've decided to do, obviously not ideally from a technical standpoint, is to grant tax incentives. But the reason they use that is that we can't really compete with everything else that developed countries have already built. We can't offer fantastic free education. We can't offer fantastic infrastructure because that costs too much and we don't have the revenue, and it becomes a vicious circle, right? If you want the revenue to improve your infrastructure, you have to get taxing rights and you have to have business paying those taxes in your country. So I think what's going on right now with the minimum tax discussion is that the developing world is certainly at a huge historical disadvantage, and this disadvantage in attracting investment and attracting business and obtaining taxing rights from those businesses is completely overlooked in the discussion, you know. I agree that tax competition is not ideal, everything else being equal, but everything else is not equal. If we all had the same capacity to attract investment, it would be fine to do over with tax competition, but that's not the case. So I guess the only way it would be beneficial for developing countries to give up on this sole area where they are competitive is to have unitary taxation and to make sure that they still get taxing rights and that they still get revenues for improving their infrastructure and improving their education, security, safety for their citizens and all that. So definitely, you know, if we keep the taxing rules and the allocation of taxing rights as it is right now, companies will have no incentive to locate their assets, their risks, and their functions in developing countries going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. I'm happy that we hear two perspectives also emerging economies, that is Natalia Quiñones from Colombia and Suranjali from India. So I will give now the word to Noam Nocket. He wrote an article on the topic of BEPS. Noam, please go ahead.
Thanks very much, Irma. And I would like to suggest a simple solution for developing countries and also low tax jurisdictions like Hong Kong in the context of Pillar 2, which goes to the third statement. Do we need to modify Pillar 2 so that the jurisdictions with the primary taxing rights collect the tax revenues and not lose it for the UPE jurisdictions that implement the IIR? And the answer is that they can by a simple fix. They just need to adopt a domestic minimum tax that is modeled after GLOBE, exactly based on the same scope and parameters of Pillar 2, and impose it on domestic constituent entities. And this idea is actually, you can find support to it in the blueprint for Pillar 2. You just need to go to page 131, deep inside the technical discussion of the UTPR, that the OECD, twice in the body of the text and twice in the footnotes, says that yes, jurisdictions, low tax jurisdictions can adopt a domestic minimum tax modeled after GLOBE in order to increase the ETR to the global minimum tax. And this implies that this should be considered as a covered tax for the purposes of Pillar 2. So this actually means that there is no supremacy for the IIR jurisdictions because the source jurisdictions, the host countries, including jurisdictions like Hong Kong and Singapore, and also developing countries that offer tax incentives that might be taken away by the IIR jurisdictions, now can adopt a domestic minimum tax modeled after GLOBE. The legislation should be very simple. They just need to adopt the model legislation of GLOBE and add one line that the same rules apply to domestic constituent entities, and then the revenue will go to them. Then what can they do with that revenue? They can try to see if they can maintain the competitiveness by granting some other benefits or tax concessions or non-tax subsidies or something else in order to attract investment. And this goes to the first statement. What should developing countries do? Should they adopt a domestic minimum tax or the GLOBE package? And the question is, what's the alternative? So do they want to concede and just give these tax revenues to other jurisdictions? My view is that they would be better off by adopting a domestic minimum tax modeled after GLOBE to minimum the impact on other parts of their economy and tax system, and use the tax revenues in order to maintain their attractiveness. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Noam. And I will give now the word to Art. Art, please.
Thank you, Irma, and hello, everybody. Yeah, there's much has been said to reply to all the arguments, and I don't have much to add to the arguments in favor or against the positions you have mentioned. But there's one thing I want to say, and it's something I regularly bring up in the UN Tax Expert Committee, and that is a slight objections against the way you propose or you pose the question, suggesting that it's a question of developing countries against developed countries. I think that is a far too simplistic way of presenting. Some of us have already said that the differences between or within the developing countries are huge. But if you look at the discussion on a possible introduction of the minimum rate in Europe, you will, and everybody assumes that all countries in Europe belong to the category of developed countries. You see exactly the same discussion about different interests between, for instance, Germany and Ireland. So I think the question is valid, and the different points of view have been made clear by the earlier speakers, but to pose it as a question of either developing countries or developed countries who have opposing interests, I think is a bit too simplistic, and that's the only thing I had to add. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I agree, Art, because I think that the idea is to put it developing countries, but it's still too simplistic. And for instance, when you see Eastern European countries, or you see also developing countries like China, for instance, that is a developing country for certain things, and for others it's a developed country, definitely. So just keep that in mind, because I think it is a valuable remark from Art. I will give now the word to Martin de Wilde.
Yeah, Irma, thanks. Thanks also for inviting me. I agree with much that's already been said, and on the question on whether it's in your interest to relinquish your control as a developing country. To be honest, I'd be quite hesitant, to answer that affirmatively. Also, because I think it much depends, on the responsiveness of investment in these countries to the tax incentive regimes these countries give, and then how would the equation, in terms of investment location decisions turn out, without the incentive vis-a-vis the investment with the incentive, also in terms of influx of revenue. And also considering that I think much of investment in transfer pricing terms in the developing world is routine, and I'm not sure whether that is like a scarce commodity. I don't think so. So I can imagine that this responsiveness could be quite, significant. And also, considering that's all, the thing that's already been mentioned is that the Pillar 2 is geared towards, the capital exporting countries. I don't see, any ways, that would lead to an influx of tax base, into the developing world. So that would mean, I think that I would be rather, hesitant to say that this would be something like a good idea. So in a way, I was very interested also in the remarks of Noam on moving towards the minimum in terms of introducing the GLOBE system as a tax system, but that also considers, or at least is based, I think, on the assumption that that these countries will still be competitive also without a tax system, and I'm not too sure on that. So perhaps alternative as perhaps something suboptimal, also considering a negative connotation with incentive regimes. I would say perhaps that it would be in the interest to introduce some carve-outs, because any carve-out you would introduce into the Pillar 2 system will basically neutralize the impact and the effectiveness of the system. So then if you start to introduce these carve-outs, for instance, on special tax zones, economic zones, particularly geared towards the interests of developing countries, I could imagine that it would be beneficial to move into that direction if these countries would be able to create sufficient sway politically to do something like that. So yeah, yeah, I'd be quite hesitant to say that it's a good idea to give up your autonomy, also considering that much of investment in these countries is routine, so not that like scarce or unique. So then you will need to compete via the tax system in any way at the end of the day. That would be my intuition at least. But of course, at the end of the day, much depends at the end of the day on the elasticities and the responsiveness, I think, of tax incentive regimes to in relation to domestic investment. Yeah. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. I think that we have given a kind of a view from all of you. Thank you so much for your contributions about what does it mean for one of discussions of tax incentives and all type of tax incentives, what you mentioned with the special economic zones, and also looking at the differences in the proposals. Perhaps I would just give now the word to Joachim English, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Irma, for inviting me. I'll try to make some quick comments on all three questions, and I would like to sound a little bit more positive note than the previous speaker. Even though I think it's really necessary to distinguish between the American proposal and the Pillar 2. So regarding the first question, could it make sense to relinquish control? I mean, how much control do you really relinquish? That's the first question. And that's very different under the Biden plan as compared to GLOBE. Because if you look at GLOBE, I mean, it's just for the largest ones. It's for CBCR multinationals, so basically 8,000, 9,000 companies worldwide. That means you can still fully set incentives, your tax policy in every way possible for SMEs in your country. It's not effective. Plus, if we consider that discussions were always revolving around a rate of 12.5, maximum 15, in my view, probably still 12.5, that's low enough for developing countries, I think, to still have some competitive edge over developed countries, where unless we're talking about tax havens, we will not usually get low to this kind of numbers. And as to the rest, so the big corporations investing worldwide, could it be beneficial then to relinquish some control? I think so, yes, basically. Under the GLOBE at least, because if you look what happens, there's studies, especially by Torslov, by Zugman, but also by Keane and others, that really show that next to Europe, developing countries suffer most in terms of revenue losses from tax competition. I mean, as Art said, they're not all the same, but in general, they suffer most together with the Europeans. And in particular, as Stephen has mentioned, there is these indirect effects. So the tax competition acts as a constraint, according to studies by Johannessen, for example, on developing countries' liberty, sovereignty, de facto, to raise their corporate rates, because they must fear to lose out against other developing countries, most of all. And that's the second big point that I have. What do you think you gain by entering into full tax competition when all your neighboring developing countries are doing the same? Now, again, not all are the same, but most of them will do that. So your competitive edge by doing that is actually much smaller than you might think, because all the other developing countries are doing it as well. And so if a floor were established, but the floor is not too high, then you still get your edge vis-a-vis the developed countries, but you don't have to compete cutthroat, race to the bottom vis-a-vis the other developing countries. I think that also has some implications for the incentives. Now, very brief, I think there is enough room. Again, if it's globally, not the US proposal, all the SMEs are not affected. You can offer what kind of incentives you want. If we're talking about M&Es, there is still the possibility of some blending, jurisdictional blending. So if you give some targeted incentives for R&D, they can set that off against a higher tax rate for other activities they have, other profits they have. Plus, let's not forget, there is also the possibility of direct subsidies. You can give direct subsidies. That has very little effect on the effective tax rate. Instead of tax incentives, you could give direct subsidies, which are more transparent usually, so there's also more public control over that. I think that could be a positive effect. And finally, the last question, shouldn't we allocate more taxing rights under a minimum tax to developing countries because they will tend to not gain much under the income inclusion rule or the American model? Yeah, that would be a good thing, but it would also complicate things probably. So there is the meter. I'm sure Alex will say something about that in a couple of minutes as an alternative that would give more to developing countries by using a different allocation key. But I think in principle, it would make sense to me, more sense, to rather expand first order market jurisdiction rights, withholding taxes, or just jurisdiction rights as we now see them developing, I mean, very, very small at the beginning, under Pillar 2, more jurisdiction, market jurisdiction taxing rights in the first place. So you don't need these secondary rights under a minimum tax. And that would, I think, be preferable over making the minimum tax more complicated. Thanks.
Thanks, Joachim. And we now have Marlene Parker. She also from Jamaica, from the Minister of Finance in Jamaica. What is interesting to see sometimes is that, for instance, when we started with Suranjali and what they discussed about what harmful tax competition is, and this also being about tax competition, and in Jamaica has been facing all these situations. So I'm very, very eager to hear what do you think about Joachim's proposal and what do you think about the statements. Marlene, what is...
Okay, thank you, Irma, and thanks for inviting me. Well, I'll just respond briefly to the issue, the first question about relinquishing of fiscal policy. And not surprising, I think that that would be a very undemocratic way to proceed. I think that that is a sovereign right that countries guard very jealously. And so I think it would be dangerous for developing countries to relinquish their taxing rights, notwithstanding the benefits of a METR. There are obvious benefits. However, I think their countries should retain their fiscal policies, and particularly developing countries, because I believe that we are more at risk. History has shown that countries have and been exploited by both MNEs as well as developed countries. This is illustrated by the levels of illicit financial flows out of poorer countries due to corporate tax avoidance, current imbalance in taxing rights between resident and source countries, which has resulted from an imbalance in treaty negotiations leverage between developed and developing economies. And all countries, and particularly developing countries, will need funding to rebuild their economies after the pandemic. And so I think the focus really needs to look ultimately at how you can improve domestic resource mobilizations to fund the rebuilding of their countries. And I think relinquishing your fiscal policy rights could impede that effort. Also, concerned about the fact that the way the question is framed, it seems to suggest that developing countries are homogeneous, that there is no difference in terms of capacity and as well as resources. I mean, when I compare a Jamaica to an India, for example, there is no, there is no there are obvious differences there. It also assumes that a minimum minimum tax will remove the incentives for MNEs to profit shift. The lower the proposed tax is the further it is away from most corporate tax rates in developing countries, 25%, 30%. And so it is left to be seen how that will impact the profit shifting issues. I have a few more comments, but I'll just quickly say as well that one of the things that I'm concerned about is the fact that it is not clear from the discussions that are going on now whether or not the developed countries are willing to relinquish their fiscal policy rights. Certainly in terms of the unilateral measures, it is not clear that they are going to be repealing those measures in order to conform to the unified approach. So I think that is a question that still needs to be answered. In terms of the incentives, I will just, and I think the both issues are linked, because if you retain incentives, then you are holding on to your, you're not relinquishing your fiscal policy abilities. And I think definitely incentives should be retained. I think countries should still have the right, developing countries in particular, should still have the right to retain their incentives. I'm quite aware of the benefits of the minimum business tax in terms of bringing more coherence to the system, the fact that you have the subject to tax rule in the treaties, you have the GLOBE rules and that kind of thing, and that is supposed to reduce the abuse that can take place by way of base erosion. However, I believe that you have to look at where countries are. And I look, for example, very quickly at my own country. where we have had to introduce, we repealed all our incentives, by the way, a couple of years ago, but we retained a special economic zone. And even though it has not contributed significantly by way of GDP, it is the biggest job provider in a country where you just have 2 out of 10 students going on to tertiary education. So you're looking at low-skilled jobs, and that has an impact on crime, social dysfunctionality. And so therefore, I think that countries have to look at where they are, what their economic model is. They have to look at their system as a whole and determine whether or not incentives, well-managed, transparent incentives will be necessary in order to stimulate their economies. And the incentives can be controlled by way of the minimum business tax put in domestic law, as well as the peer review system. So for that reason, I think that countries should retain their incentives, notwithstanding the benefits of the METR. Those are my comments.
Thank you so much, Marlene. We will go now to Arnold Merkes from SOMO. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Irma. Yeah, we have discussed this before already. This is actually how we came to this this conference. Thank you for organizing it, in the first place. Yeah, I want to say something. We discussed this as well within the Tax Justice Europe community. What we especially looked at is, well, so what are the red lines where we think, well, then it would become, after a while, it would become unacceptable. And one of the things is where we say, well, when it would limit countries from taking further unilateral actions, if that would be the case. It could also limit countries, like, for example, in terms of binding arbitrage. We haven't talked about that yet. And then the other thing is, if it amplifies the race to the bottom, it's setting a minimum rate could also amplify the race to the bottom, especially if it's a low rate, of course. We should be aware of that. And I think for that reason, it should also be constantly monitored and not having a review after many years and then finding out that it was actually the case that it amplified the race to the bottom. If you find out it amplifies the race to the bottom, you could constantly adjust your rate or your measures to make sure that you're actually going up in income, in tax income, because that's what you want. And then the third one is when it would lead to a more unequal division, so especially among countries. And then to react on Art, what he said, well, I think there is a difference, a clear difference between developing countries and other countries. And that's, of course, where well, actually two things. One is where the capital is, so how the money flows. And that's what you see also in all the tax treaties is an important issue. And the other thing is where the head offices are. Obviously, for that, it's important the income inclusion rule. If you favor the income inclusion rule, and then it's important where the head offices are. So, so these are a few things we discussed within Tax Justice Europe. And then the other thing to react on your on the incentives. Well, I agree with Joachim that first of all, it's this only the very big companies. So for SMEs, you could do it anyway, and then you don't have to do it by taxes. There are many ways to promote innovation. Of course, your infrastructure, but also subsidies, which you could control much better. Of course, you could argue that in some countries there would be an infant industry argument to temporarily have incentives. That could also be done through subsidies. And then also, it is really important to have the time measure. So to say, for example, well, if you want to do it now, then don't do a tax holiday for 20 years or something, because then you also you did it for the next 20 years and you're not voted for this many years. So it should be temporarily, and it should only focus on well, if you're in a position that you're behind and you have an infant industry argument, that you could temporarily do that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arnold. We are taking now, I'm okay because we still have 1 hour, 10 minutes. And please also for the audience and the public in general, feel free to react also in the chat. There is a lot of discussion going on also in the chat. I will just give the word now to Alice from Tax Justice Network. Please go ahead.
Thanks, Irma, for the invitation also. On the point about sovereignty, I think it's clear that there is a real threat to sovereignty here, but it doesn't come from the minimum tax. The minimum tax is very well established as a sovereignty protection mechanism. My sovereignty is threatened when all of the profits from activity in my country end up in Luxembourg or the Netherlands. My sovereignty is not threatened by those profits having to have an effective rate of tax, some of which comes to me. But what does threaten sovereignty for almost every country in the world, certainly those outside the G7, is that this deal is at risk of being done on the basis of not only a very undemocratic and untransparent process, but also with an OECD blueprint, which is entirely unconscionable in the way that it privileges headquarters countries. So all of the countries from which we've heard speakers today, if I look at our analysis of what those countries could receive at 15% or 21% under the OECD approach or under our preferred approach, the meter, which Joachim mentioned, it's in the range of 2 to 3 times more. At 15%, India might get $4 billion under the OECD approach. They get about 3 times that, slightly more, under the meter approach. The meter just takes the same undertaxed profit as the OECD approach, but then instead of discriminating between headquarters and host countries, it apportions the undertaxed profit according to where the real activity, the sales and employment take place. So it takes some of the ideas, the ambition that was lost in Pillar 1, the kind of G24 proposals that the Secretariat squashed, and brings it into Pillar 2. It's not perfect, but it's much, much better than the OECD proposals. If we go ahead with the OECD proposal, we look at the G7 countries, about 10% of the world's population and 40-something% of the world economy, taking more than 60% of the revenues. This is a measure that puts, even with the OECD approach, even at 15%, something like $275 billion of additional revenues each year on the table. Countries like Jamaica, India, China, countries at different income levels in completely different circumstances stand to gain substantial revenues in many cases if those undertaxed profits are apportioned fairly. If they're done under the OECD approach, without those countries having a say, they will also end up with very little in the way of additional revenues. And we should not be sitting here discussing this as if it was, in a sense, a technical question. There is clearly a very strong case for global collaboration on this, and it will be sovereignty enhancing. But as the current process stands, the current dominance of the OECD and particularly the G7, it will be sovereignty eroding for everyone. And we need to get this to the United Nations and into a quite different setting if it's going to be fundamentally sovereignty enhancing as it should be, and address within that the broader set of issues that Marlene raised about wider illicit financial flows. We know OECD countries are responsible for the great majority of the corporate and individual tax abuse losses suffered by countries at all income levels. We cannot allow the OECD countries to be the ones who keep making the rules unless we are happy with them to keep doing that. And I don't think any of us are.
Very valuable, Alice. I think that, that this is also the question. So what we need to do, we need to follow the OECD, we need to follow the US, what we need to do, and how developing countries can also benefit from all of this. And keeping also in mind what Art just mentioned, the caveat with developing countries. So let me give the word to Abdul from South Center.
Thank you, Irma, and thank you for organizing this meeting. I have a series of points to make on the comments made by the other distinguished roundtable discussants. So I'll begin by supporting the statement made by Natalia that developing countries don't have that many levers for bringing in investment. So tax policy is one of the levers which they have. So the question or the statement which you had framed for discussion that it's in a developing country's best interest to relinquish control. I want to share an anecdote, an experience I saw. It was the renegotiation of a tax treaty where one was a big country and the other one was a tax haven effectively. And the big country was losing money because of the tax treaty with the tax haven. But finally, they succeeded in renegotiating it only when the tax haven told them that, look, if this is renegotiated, we'll lose a lot of jobs for our people. So if you can give us some sort of an aid package to rehabilitate these people or give them more jobs, then we'll get rid of the problematic clauses. And that's what finally made the renegotiation go through. Now, given that most of the beneficiaries from Pillar 2 are developed countries or high-income countries, and since this is a discussion for provocative statements, maybe I can share a provocative suggestion. Maybe the high-income countries which are going to benefit from Pillar 2 can use some of that extra money they get to rehabilitate developing countries which are going to, especially the tax havens, which are going to lose out from some of the employment in their countries or some sort of additional aid. I think that's something to think about, because it is true that for small countries, especially tax havens, I'm talking about those particularly which are developing countries. For them, it's also a way to give jobs to their people, financial services. So it's something to think about. That was my comment on the first point. On the second point, it's interesting that Pillar 2 is the second pillar of the tax challenges of the digitalized economy. Because if we talk about tax incentives, we are assuming that the company is paying taxes. But it's very unlikely that for many developing countries, these digital giants are paying taxes, because only if you pay taxes, then you can take the benefits of an incentive. What is happening that most of them are actually enjoying a de facto tax exemption or a tax holiday. So that's just something to put out there. So on the point which you had on the discussion question about tax incentives, I want to first of all agree completely with what Steve said. The most important question is really the rule order, and that's what developing countries are fighting for in the negotiations in the inclusive framework, that the first rule that comes is the subject to tax rule, and then followed by the undertax payment rule. Because if the income inclusion rule comes first, if all the money goes to the developed countries, then what is going to be left to redistribute? It doesn't really make much sense. But that being said, talking of tax incentives specifically, tax holidays and so on, it would be difficult to maintain those under the Pillar 2 regime. But tax incentives which are cost-based, such as amortization of capital, or also known as accelerated depreciation, these, the Pillar 2 blueprint does have some provisions. I think paragraphs 222 to 225 deal with these, with this problem of how can we allow these cost-based incentives to continue. And they have given two solutions which I think are interesting and which require more discussion. They haven't been discussed that much in the public. One is on the use of deferred tax accounting for depreciable property that is eligible for immediate expensing or accelerated depreciation for tax purposes. And the other one is to use, for the M&E, to use local tax depreciation rules, which would be applied to the carrying cost of assets as determined for financial accounting purposes. Now, there are some more technical aspects to these, but these are two ways through which the timing differences, which would effectively negate the tax and cost-based tax incentives, can be accounted for. Because otherwise, what would happen is the income inclusion rule would be triggered, and then they would have to be given back as a tax credit. But practically, that would negate the effect of a tax incentive. I also want to support what Joaquin said, which is that, which Noam said, I think, about this domestic minimum tax, which I think he said was on page 131 of the blueprint. Paragraph 491 of the blueprint also, in fact, reiterates that solution. It says that a country can introduce an annual domestic minimum tax on income with the same tax base and the tax rate as the GLOBE rules, and that would effectively make the exclusion ineffective, so they could maintain their tax incentive in that way, while also, as he said, bringing in some amount of revenue for them. So those are some comments from my side. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Abdul. We have some already people who will want to also give their comments. So I will give the word now to Tommaso, and then after we will start a little, Tommaso and Alison, and then we will start again with Scott, Suranjali, and Steve, since they were first. So there has been a lot of discussion until now. Tommaso, please go ahead.
Thank you, Emma. Just to reflect the position of Oecd, so the position of our commissioners, which have experience as former finance ministers and head of tax authorities in countries such as Colombia, Nigeria, and Philippines. I mean, their view is that overall, tax incentives do not lead to additional investment, and so a minimum tax is a positive good. At the same time, their view is that often the ability to give tax incentive is something that business ministers like, and so they provide power to certain government officials, but also provide opportunities for perverse ways of giving those incentives. The other point is about the negotiation. So we have, and I think many of you made a point of developing countries. There isn't no such a thing as one homogeneous developing country group. In the inclusive framework, we have some developing countries represented. We have many developing countries that are outside the inclusive framework, and for which, if we assume the US will introduce the new guilty rule, they will simply have to comply with that. So let's I think like Ghana, for example, they might have US multinationals operating there, affiliates, and therefore they not have any participation in the negotiation of the guilty rule, but they will have to face the consequences. And so in a way, the status quo is that home countries and multinationals can introduce this unilaterally. And this is perhaps why G24 have focused, which have collected the views of a number of developing countries within the inclusive framework, have focused a lot on their demand on the Pillar 1, which is for a reallocation of taxing rights. And whilst at the same time ensuring that they do have first pick in applying the subject to tax rule, and for the subject to tax rule being included in the final deal. So I think one big issue is, in terms of the minimum tax is likely to happen. The rate will be something that, but it's not going to be a universal application. No, I don't expect all countries that will introduce such a minimum tax, and it will not apply to all businesses that we said, but it will apply to a vast majority of global corporate profits potentially. So the one question is the ordering rule, and I think the suggestion by Noam Nocht is really interesting to understand whether this is not something that is currently subject to discussion within the OECD, that proposal to do something that will allow them to introduce unilaterally a source country level, but this is something that G24 and other source countries in the global south could and should consider. But ultimately, this is a negotiation where there are some demands that G24 countries have made, particularly on Pillar 1, to increase the scope, to increase the pot of money that they were likely to get. And so there is a potential quid pro quo in terms of what they want to get out of this negotiation, if it's in their interest, if it is in the interest at all to sign up to this negotiation. But ultimately, there are some power, so the different power between G7, G24, G20, and the rest of the inclusive framework, and many countries outside the inclusive framework. And we kind of need to be aware of these power dynamics. Thank you.
I think I'm next, right?
Sorry, Alison?
I think I'm next, right?
Yes, you are next.
Great.
Thank you.
So it's such an exciting time to be in international tax. And so thank you for putting together this roundtable. And I've really enjoyed listening to the comments, and there's been a discussion in the chat as well. So this is a great topic, and I want to make a couple of points. The first point is, when you go back and you see where did we get the idea that you can't tax a company unless it has a physical presence? Well, you get it from a world that looks a lot different than the world we're in today. So all the global minimum tax stuff and all that, all these ideas that are floating around don't matter in terms of the distribution if you can't get more at source. And if we keep hanging on to the idea of physical presence as a prerequisite somehow to tax at source wherever there's a treaty, I mean, it's obviously not a prerequisite. You can tax anything if you don't have a treaty, right? Like, nobody says you have to have a permanent establishment if you don't have a treaty. You can tax anybody, anywhere, on any terms you choose, and no one can really stop you from doing that. So what we're really talking about are the terms of cooperation, and why is it that and baked into the terms of cooperation, global cooperation between countries of vastly different capacities, vastly different wealth amounts, that we still cling to those old cooperative ideas. And now we're talking about global minimum taxes as if that can be done without thinking about those other things. So I would say the answer to the first question, is it in anybody's best interest to relinquish? Well, we've already all relinquished. It's too late. It's a global economy. We're all in this together. The question is not whether you're relinquishing autonomy. The question is, who gets to decide what the terms of cooperation are? And to that end, how can we still continue to accept the idea that the OECD has made a mini UN because the key countries of the OECD didn't want to fund the UN tax committee? They don't want to fund it. They don't want it to be a full committee. They want the OECD to do this work. The OECD is supposed to be a statistical, information sharing organization for member countries. And as it was pointed out by me and by many others, you can talk about equal footing all day long, but you cannot make an international tax system on the back of a metaphor that no one understands. It's not real. What is real is that everybody has to deal with the idea that you can tax whatever you want against a constraint of a global economy in which you have no control, virtually no control, unless you close your borders, unless you start enacting protectionism. So for me, the question is not sovereignty or no sovereignty, cooperate or don't cooperate. It's the bigger idea that we're already cooperating on trade. We're already cooperating on IP. We accept the idea of the corporation that it can be created anywhere. We accept the legal notion of IP that it can be put anywhere. And once you build all those things and you build in the notion of comity between nations, where you're going to accept when one nation says a corporation exists, another one is going to accept that it does in fact exist. Once you built a whole system on top of that, the tax system is built on top of that, then those terms of cooperation, I think, are getting us into some trouble. So for me, I think we are at a point where it is just time. It's past time to, first of all, completely reject the idea that it's okay for the OECD to run the show. I don't understand that. I get it that the UN is, it's hard to get things done, but for decades, the countries of the OECD have been claiming more than their share of the available revenues. They have been scraping money out of the developing countries all over the world. We have been doing this for decades, and we have been hiding behind technical language and niceties and traditions and assumptions. And it's high time to just say, that's not okay. That's wrong. That shouldn't be happening. And it's hard to explain what's going to take its place. But I think the place that we have to start, if we think that what we care about is the distribution of money after everything is said and done and all the rules are written, if that's what we're talking about, then why aren't we talking about what is the correct way to think about how money should be distributed normatively? Why are we not asking those questions? Because the OECD doesn't have any capacity to ask those questions. That is not anything the OECD can do. They're not willing and they're not able, and so they give us metaphors which ultimately must fail, will fail, and you can't buy into that. So that's just my 2 cents, and I look forward to what everyone else will say the rest of the day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alison, because actually it has been 1 hour and I can imagine that people are losing and then you get back to us and put us on track. So let's continue to talk about developing countries, and I will want to give again the word to Suranjali and then after to Steve, Shay, and to Scott, since they were at the beginning, and then now after 1 hour we can continue the discussion. Yes, please, Suranjali.
Thanks, Irma. It's a luxury to have a second chance to speak. So I just want to circle back and say that there are some very interesting points being made about an alternative minimum tax already in place in a lot of developing countries. For example, even India has. I think so long as incentives are offered with clarity, with sunset clauses, and an evaluation, a periodical evaluation, I think countries should have the right to choose that. India has made significant efforts to sort of shut down the R&D incentives, put a sunset clause on the SEZ incentives. So I think in spirit, we're in line with what the minimum tax proposal suggests. I do not know why we need to sort of write that on paper. The other thing is that, yes, source-based taxation, and Alison sort of alluded to it. I think one thing that strikes me always is the offshore indirect transfer. I was just looking at the MLI submission, and even though it applies only to the immovable property, 48 countries declined to incorporate it. And so if you're saying there are holding structures, which the CDCR data gives us an information on, which are a source of moving economic activity away from jurisdictions where it should be taxed, then the source rules such as this should be important as well. And we are sort of focusing on these broad global issues wherein we have to get everyone to agree on a single rate. Alison raised another very interesting question, saying that if it's an open economy now, why not just get ahead and accept that there's no sovereignty? And in my view, I feel like as an economist, you're trained to read the Mundell-Fleming model, where you say interest rates converge across economies as they open up, and these things do not happen because there are rigidity and specificities of a market. Hello? Yeah. So there are rigidities and specificities of a market, and so tax is the only thing left, I guess. It is perhaps worth guessing whether tax has converged to its global optimal. And with the setting of the minimum, we are sort of recalibrating that optimal. Lastly, it's been a 100-year progress, and we can start from scratch, but I don't think there should be rushed to etch it out so that it's a final proposal. So, and of course, you have other backstops such as limitation of benefits that can ensure that third countries don't come and exploit incentives that you bilaterally negotiate in the treaty. So, those are my thoughts.
Thank you so much, Suranjali. I will give now the word to Steve.
Thank you, Irma. I'll try and quickly touch on a number of prior points. I'm sorry that these are not in some exactly rational order, but let me start by saying that in terms of governance, I think the issue is less important between OECD than UN, although that is important as is reflected in the chat. It really depends on what the rules are that govern decision making. But even more important than that, it really comes down ultimately to power. And let me step back a moment. One of the things to understand about the United States is that we are a very inward-looking nation politically. We have a relatively small portion of our population that even crosses borders. Some don't even cross state borders. Very few look at the rest of the world in relative to other countries represented here in this group. So our politics are inward-looking. Our focus is inward-looking. And frankly, the US is looking out for its own self-interest. as is, I think, all countries. So I think the cooperation has to be understood as cooperation that finds a way to meet self-interest of the participants. At some level, that ultimately comes to power. And if the lower income countries do not essentially act in a relatively combined basis, they are not going to offset the very strong economic power of the G7 or the major countries. So that's just an observation. That brings me back to the question of the key issue, which I do think has been identified by a number of speakers, Alex, others, is the current system is heavily weighted in favor of what Alex referred to as headquarters countries, I refer to as capital exporting countries. That goes back 100 years. In order to get more of the taxing right, which is not the intent of Pillar 2, as it's very explicit about, then there's going to have to be a demand for it that reflects power. And the greatest power that developing countries have is simply to not agree to Pillar 2, not agree to the process and force a rechange. Is that realistic? Is that the best way to go? I frankly don't know. I haven't thought that through, but I do know that absent that, there will not be the fundamental resorting that Alex is referring to. It just has to be, and that power can be exercised in the OECD framework if they follow through on what they say, that everybody is going to essentially, it has to be a consensus. So the consensus could be denied. That's on the governance side. Coming back to some more specifics, Joachim mentioned that there is going to be room for competition because Pillar 2 under the OECD model, as opposed to the US model, would only cover the very largest companies. I agree with that observation. I just don't think that's a stable outcome. And we're already seeing in the EU a response to US pressure not to discriminate against US companies, that the EU approach is apparently going to be to drop the minimum size. And I just think that's inevitable over time. So we should look at Pillar 2 and Pillar 1 as ultimately looking a lot more like the US approach. And I think the US GILTI is going to force it in that direction. With respect to unilateral measures, I don't think it's realistic that countries give up their unilateral measures. I see us moving in the direction of not requiring that for the outcome because I think it's untenable. But I think the response will be only discriminatory unilateral measures would not be permitted. And that response, countries that have those aimed at very large companies that today are mostly US, simply drop the threshold. That's an answer to the unfairness of unilateral measures. So I don't see the system as necessarily ultimately resulting in getting rid of that. With respect to a very interesting observation by Abdul of tying some of the outcomes here to perhaps other move outside of tax and condition it on aid to other countries. I have not thought enough about that. That's always challenging for any governance system to move out of its silos. The OECD doesn't talk about distribution of aid in the tax group, so it has to involve somebody else. But one way to think about that could be politically meaningful to the developed countries is somehow to link the fact that that aid will affect immigration. Immigration is one of the largest political problems in all of the developed countries. So if that aid can be tied to reducing immigration, which I think it would in fact have that effect, then I think there's something to be thought about in that area to help reallocate some of the benefits from the exporting or headquarters countries to other countries, at least until there's a more fundamental resorting of the tax base. I've taken too long. Irma, thank you for I think you asked me to take the floor. I was perfectly happy, but thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'm really grateful for that you are taking all the last hour trying to react to this. I will give the word now to Scott. Scott Wilkie?
Yeah, thanks, Irma. I'll try to be equally brief. I reflect, but from my own perspective, in much the same way that Steve just has. But maybe I'll respond to some of the discussion just by drawing attention to some fundamental questions, which I think the surface of the pillars and the minimum tax discussion mask. It's been said by a number of our commentators in this session that developing countries are not homogeneous among themselves. I take that a step further. I would say no countries are homogeneous among themselves. That is, and fundamentally, what a discussion that is presuming the existence, and I think this discussion, not our discussion, but the discussion generally, the conversation generally in the world at the moment presumes, and it's an interesting morphing of BEPS into this assumption through the pillars, that there is a single global tax system, and somehow or other, all we're engaged in is sorting out who the winners and the losers are, or how to allocate the income. I mean, the allocation mechanisms were discussed by the League of Nations back in the 1930s, and we've studiously avoided the inevitable references to fractional or formula apportionment on a prescriptive basis because I think fundamentally, countries fundamentally are insecure about what the impacts of those kinds of determinations would be. And I note that in all of this discussion, country by country impact assessments of the effect of the pillars are still not clear, even if they would exist. The second observation I guess I would make is, drawing this back to a more centric tax discussion, is that what we're really fundamentally talking about is the fiscal effectiveness of tax expenditures on the one hand, which is a problematic notion everywhere. And secondly, some common view of what the source of income is, because even if we were to agree on mechanisms under Pillar 1, leave Pillar 2 aside for the moment, but it affects Pillar 2 too, we still don't have a universal agreement on what the source of the income is to which any of these mechanisms for apportioning the tax related to the source would be. Effectively, I think all of this discussion is seeking some sort of a universal or consensual determination of of what the source of income is, and I think that's a question that needs to be faced more directly. Thirdly, there's a lot of this discussion is on the allocation of income or tax on the assumption that it would otherwise be collected. But I think a focus that is more concerning is on what the implications of any of this have on where the activities that generate the income would be located. I think conceptually or theoretically, all of the discussion that underlies the expectation that there's some sort of a single system and on the basis of principles of equity or otherwise, we're simply going to all share and cooperate in each other's interests is a fine assumption from a social justice, global social justice point of view, but I don't think it reflects the reality of countries' fiscal policies or the non-homogeneity of countries. I mean, I think it's fair to say, as Allison said in the chat, that we may exist in a world where, in some sense or other, sovereignty has been abandoned. But I don't think that's the end of the story. I think the question is in whose interests and on whose terms do any of these determinations get made, and I don't think we can avoid that question by looking at the impacts of any of this, whether it's the U.S. plan or the pillars, on where the activities to generate the income would be, because one of the fault lines in this that I see is that if it becomes a matter of indifference, where the tax is paid, then our mobile activities, which for the reasons Allison indicates are mobile in our new world, simply going to gravitate, to where they might as well take place in the headquarters countries or the home countries, or however you want to talk about it. So I'll stop there, but I think that there are some undercurrents in this discussion that the mechanics and the technique of tax don't address as well as they could.
Thank you so much, Scott. And we will go back to Marlene, please, from Jamaica.
Yes, thank you for allowing me the floor again, Irma. Just a couple of comments. I'm just responding to something that was said by Steve in his intervention regarding the fact that developing countries will have to group themselves together in order to have a say in relation to the U.S. proposals and the blueprint. And so I think it is worthy that that ATAF and the G24 have been making those attempts, and that they have made counter proposals. There are issues of instances of convergence, but I think we need to bear in mind that there are also what could be considered deal breakers. And even though we have not discussed it here, I know that one of those deal breakers is the issue of tax certainty and the issue of mandatory binding arbitration. And so I believe that it will be interesting to see how the whole negotiation process plays out, because it seems to me now that everything has to be negotiated on in order to reach a decision, including the issue, I think, of the Pillar 2 issues. So I just wanted to raise that point. The other point I wanted to raise as well, and it's more a question. It is not clear to me whether or not we are still talking about these issues in the context of digitalization of the economy, or we are now talking about what has been dubbed as globalization of the economy. Because when you look at the US proposals in particular, there is you know, the 100 companies that are proposed to be within scope for Amount A in particular. There is no restriction to them being digitalized companies, and so that is a question that maybe my colleagues online could help me to kind of figure out whether or not we are still talking about digitalization or we are speaking about something else. And if we are talking about something else, then are we talking about the same architecture and that we have been talking about for the past 5 years and have been trying to refine? That's just my question. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Marlene. Now I will give the word to Natalia. She was before also participating as representative of Colombia in the G24, but now is in a personal capacity because she doesn't work anymore for the tax administration. But I think this is interesting what Marlene was saying about the different counter proposals between ATAF and G24. Natalia, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Irma. I want to go back to a comment made by Art and also what Alison said on sovereignty in a more general sense, not just talking about the minimum tax, which was the initial question. I have to say that I absolutely agree with Alison that sovereignty it's completely outdated to cling to a notion of sovereignty, and I think that's precisely the question. You know, going back to what Stephen said, it really strikes me as odd that countries are still inward looking when globalization is absolutely pervading in all our daily lives. So I think, you know, going back to Art, the ideal world would be a world where all governments would come together and actually regulate what these MNEs are doing without any regards to national borders. So rather than, you know, pinning developing and developed countries against each other, or investment hubs against traditional, you know, global tax countries, I think what we have to do is really come together and cooperate. I think Marlene and Stephen also have a point on, you know, how can we come together Is it just developing countries coming together with the G24 and the ATAF proposals, or can we really come together as governments and address a huge issue, which is, you know, MNEs are doing businesses everywhere. They don't have any limitation, constraints by national borders. Should we also establish a system that has no regards for national borders? And should we just tax them unitarily? Should we agree, all of us, to actually fight the common enemy, which is MNEs paying less taxes and thus, you know, being prejudicial to the general global citizens, rather than looking inwardly and finding whether I, as a country, are having an economic positive impact or neutral impact, which is, I think, also a wrong approach that the OECD has taken. You know, having the economic impacts measured by country is an incentive for countries to stop cooperating and to actually try and look after their national interests. I think that the maximum revenue that can be obtained by the world as such, and the maximum benefit for all sentient beings everywhere, would come from cooperation, but on an absolute basis, not just, you know, having cooperation on a minimum tax so that we can eliminate tax competition from the countries that are taking away our revenues, while we still allow corporations to locate their functions, risks, and assets wherever they like. I think cooperation has to be much more radical. And where it happens, I don't really care if it's the UN, if it's the OECD. I think it just has to happen. And that's a view that we all have to start having towards a more stable future, because what's going on right now, whether there's an agreement, whether there's a consensus or no consensus, it's still an unstable scenario. And if we want stability for the future, and if we want to be able to address the new technologies, you know, we're going to be facing revenues that are obtained outside of planetary borders. I was mentioning last week in a Florida conference that the space economy is becoming huge. So back to Marlene, I think we're talking about much more than just the digitalization of the economy. It's all technological advances that are happening now and that will happen in the future that become a challenge to all governments as a whole. So, I mean, this is just a comment going outside of the initial statements that were discussed proposed by Irma. But I think it's a view that we should all start discussing now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Natalia. I will give now the word to Peter. Peter Hongler, please.
Thank you, Irma, and thank you for all these interesting comments. And first of all, I don't dare to recommend anything to developing states, as I'm just not in a position to do so. But let me give a few comments. First of all, I think there is broad agreement that we should protect source. If I hear to what Noam says, what Alex says, what Abdul says, all your proposals basically, they aim at protecting source. And I think the source principle still has a normative validity, and I fully support measures that go into that direction, in the sense that we should aim at taxing, allowing states to tax what happens in their territory. Second of all, I think we should not underestimate the fact that, let's say, if we solve the problem of tax competition, there will be competition on other issues, be it individual income tax competition, be it competition with respect to social security contributions, etc. So we are not going to solve the question of harmful competition in general between developing and developed states through the introduction of a global minimum tax. And by saying that you already have seen what direction I go, I'm completely against a global minimum tax for several reasons. Third, with respect to carve-outs, I think we should more think about carve-outs if we go and implement the global minimum tax. However, we should also consider that then we need carve-outs in other areas as well. For instance, I once suggested that we should have carve-outs in CFC legislation for the least developed countries in the world, for instance, Liberia. So I think that's definitely something we need, we should pay a closer attention. Fourth, if I look at the recent calculations available on the market, I think we should not overestimate what we are doing in the area of corporate income tax. At the end, I read the statements such as, you know, if we introduce a global minimum tax, we will have an additional revenue of 170 billion US dollar. I mean, someone has to pay for that. And if we look at corporate tax incidence literature, we still don't really understand who is going to pay for that. So for those who think that the introduction of a global minimum tax will reduce inequalities, will solve poverty, that's simply not true. It's evidently not true, because corporate tax incidence does not go into that direction. So if we want to focus on reducing inequality, well, then we should focus on the introduction of a global minimum tax on wages, or even better, on a comprehensive individual income tax. And last, there have been successful examples of the introduction of a minimum corporate income taxes, and these are federal states. So for instance, my state in Switzerland, we have a minimum tax, and that is 7%, and that's the corporate income tax levied at the federal level. And then on top of that, and the cantons, so our states, they do have a right to levy additional corporate income taxes. Now, why does the system work? Well, because there is a way to redistribute the profits. And I think many of you have already highlighted that that could be a potential solution, that if there is a global problem to solve a tax competition, well, then we should invest additional money raised for global problems, be it a reduction of immigration, as mentioned by Steve, be it fighting climate change. So then I think there is a normative validity as well for a global minimum tax, but only if the additional funds are invested for global problems. And let me conclude here. If you look at the SDGs, and I think the SDGs are kind of the normative consensus when it comes to how we should approach the development in the world. We should not underestimate the fact that some of these SDGs, they really affect a minor part of the world. And it's not that when we introduce a global minimum tax, which will increase the corporate tax revenues in some of the most developed states, that will do any good on solving the SDG problematic. And by having said that, I think I conclude here. Thank you, Irma.
Thank you so much, Peter. I really am enjoying a lot of these discussions, and it goes from one side to the other, and I'm really happy that everyone accepted to participate and be open about it. Now we have Frederick Müller. He's a PhD in the project GLOBTAXGOV that I forgot to introduce, by the way, that investigates global tax governance, and is a project that is funded by the European Research Council. And actually, I'm the lead researcher, and Juliana Cubillos and Frederick are here, and they are the PhDs in this project. So we were the ones who actually have this started with these discussions. So let's, Frederick, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. What I would like to do is maybe to raise some questions, or also try to bring back the discussion to another point, namely what is actually the implicit assumption behind the original idea that a global minimum tax may be beneficial for developing countries if imposed by developed countries, through the idea that it would be a shield against tax competition for developing countries among themselves. So basically the idea behind that if an MNE located in Europe invests decides to invest in a developing country, and it plays different governments out against each other in a bid to attract this investment by offering the lowest tax rate. I think this is mentioned in the OECD documents, also in the US proposal, as some justification of why this would be a good idea. I tried to do some research about this and how good this justification is, and would also be curious to hear people's viewpoint on that. What I saw is that much of it is based on literature about the impact, how important is taxation for investors' decisions, and much of the literature, I think, is based on investigations only among countries of more or less a similar level of development. The question, I think, that would be relevant to answer there is what does tax matter? At what point in the decision-making process of an investor does tax matter? Does it matter when an investor decides whether to invest in a developing country at all, or does it versus a developed country, or does it only only matter when it comes to the decision in which countries of a number of countries that have similar other characteristics? I think that answering this question would be quite crucial for in the debate about whether such a potentially positive effect could be there of a global minimum tax on tax revenues in developing countries. And yeah, I would be curious to hear other views on that. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I will give the floor now to Tove Maria Reiten, and then after I will give the word to Matti Kohonen. Tove, please.
I hope you can hear me, and thank you for a very interesting debate so far. I think I agree that it's very difficult to have a technical discussion about whether developing countries should say yes or no to a minimum tax when the politics is coming out so clearly in the negotiations. First of all, I think we have so many developed countries that talk a lot about developing countries' interests and what developing countries should do, but it really is time to stop talking about developing countries and start talking with them. I mean, if we have negotiations where they don't participate on an equal footing, it's not surprising that the outcome we get is skewed in the favor of the countries that were, as it was said, running the show. And we are at a point in time now where both in Pillar 1 and in Pillar 2, it's so clear that the OECD process gave the same result as the OECD processes always do, which is it reallocates taxing rights primarily to OECD countries and large, powerful countries. And so a discussion about whether in theory developing countries would have an interest in a minimum tax gets completely distorted by the fact that the proposal on the table is so unfair. And for the developed countries to come out now and argue that, well, developing countries would have an interest in a system that gives us more taxing rights, it's a bit like reinventing a global version of the trickle-down theory where giving taxing rights to the richer countries will somehow be a benefit for the poorer countries. Give developing countries a seat at the table and we can let it be up to them whether they will accept it or not. But secondly, I think there was an important question raised by Art in the chat box about what do you do in a global negotiation? Do you want to give a veto right to Andorra and San Marino and other countries? And first of all, Andorra and San Marino are actually members of the inclusive framework. So many of the countries that often get mentioned as countries that could cause trouble in the negotiations if we went to the UN are actually already in the inclusive framework. Many of the countries with harmful tax practices were the first ones to join. The countries that are not there are in particular the least developed countries. And these countries generally have a lot of the interests that we talk about we want to protect, including a need for income to support development and the sustainable development goals. And they are not the world's biggest problems when it comes to harmful tax practices. They're just not the ones causing the problem, but they are losing out very strongly. And that would be one major change with going to the UN, is that we would have the least developed countries at the table. And secondly, on the question on how you get agreement at the United Nations, well, in a way, I think the OECD process actually should give cause to the same problem, because we're negotiating new global tax rules 5 years after we last time negotiated new global tax rules. And one is tempted to say, here comes a big revolution again. And why was it that BEPS did not solve the problem? Why was it that it took so few years and then the whole tax conflict opened up again? Well, it's because it was an agreement on the lowest common denominator that was so highly technical that it took a while for everyone to realize that fact that actually a lot of the problems just continued. And there's a high risk that we're going down the same route again. We can see the level of ambition dropping very fast, and we can see an extremely low level of ownership from a very high amount of countries, including many of the countries that are in the room. And so we already now at the EU are discussing how we can do a digital services tax that would be compliant with the Pillar 1 agreement. So we already even see OECD countries starting to say, oh, we need more than what's coming out of this deal, because it's really unambitious and because the level of ownership is so low. But what we've seen in, for example, the climate negotiations, that there are many things you can do to promote an ambitious agreement with a high level of ownership. The first thing is transparency. It's very important for the public to be able to follow the negotiations and to hold governments to account. And you have that in the United Nations negotiations. And then secondly, having all countries at the table, and in particular the least developed countries, would give us a chance to have progressive alliances of countries that we do not have today. We actually see the tax havens being better at working together than the countries that are losing out. So that would be a very important change in the dynamics. And I'm not worried about the developing countries being able to create incentives for the big countries to join an agreement, because we've seen this in the United Nations before. When it comes to multinational corporations, developing countries can play on an access and benefit sharing agreement, basically saying, if you are not willing to make sure that we get a framework that allows us to tax multinational corporations effectively, your multinational corporations are not welcome in our countries. That's something they've done before, for example, in the Nagoya Protocol negotiations. So once that kind of dynamic starts, everyone has an interest in reaching an agreement, because really no one has an interest in this continuous tax conflict. And so the only road to tax certainty would be that.
Thank you so much. I will just give the word because we have 12 minutes, and actually Tov was mentioning about the UN, and Matti was also giving some comments on that. Please go ahead, and then after Abdul, and then after we finalize. Matti, go ahead. Yeah.
Thanks. I'm Matthew Gunn from the Financial Transparency Coalition. I wanted to just mention that, and I see that some of my comments have sparked a bit of controversy. It's just that the tax cooperation was already under some of UN's normative guidance as early as the first FFD conference that took place in Monterey. That introduced, if you like, the international acceptance of the idea of tax cooperation being a global good, which was then needed to finance the MDGs. So that's really where the global civil society's interest sparked into understanding tax as a development concern and understanding tax, therefore, at the later stage, a sustainable development concern. And that was further reinforced at the Doha FFD summit, the second FFD summit. If you go through, the language was upgraded, and already at that time we had global civil society taking interest in tax matters in 2008 to try to upgrade that language and indeed support the Global South's perspectives on creating the UN tax body, which was proposed in all three FFD summits by the co-negotiators and by the expert committee that was prior to the first FFD summit in 1998, which was led by the Mexican president. So there's a whole history of the UN trying to have that mandate, and the developed countries considering that it is not for the UN to take that mandate, because they said that would be duplicating efforts is normally the language being used. But actually the framing of tax issues as a development issue, as a sustainable development issue, comes from there. And that follows really, that you cannot implement the SDGs without tax revenues and without tax cooperation. That is included in the means of implementation of SDGs, for which we have the FFD as the prime mechanism for implementing the Sustainable Development Goals. I should also go through the many citations where the UN Human Rights Committee and the special rapporteurs have said that implementing human rights commitments made at the UN isn't really possible without fulfilling the the idea of maximum available revenues being collected for the realization of human rights. And therefore, the term tax abuse, which now the UN FACTI Committee has said is the perfect term for describing behavior that reduces revenue that is of not legal behavior in all jurisdictions, while it may be legal somewhere, is a term that is now adopted by the UN FACTI Committee as an expert committee. So that's the perspective that we would argue where tax sits. And if you change the normative lens of taxation being a development in the human rights and a sustainable development issue, you really do have to implement the UN-based agreement to have those normative aspects included in negotiations rather than it being about tax competition between states. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matti. And I will give the word then, final word to Abdul, and then after to Marlene to close. Abdul, please go ahead.
Thank you, Irma. I just want to build on the point made by Tove and the others about the views of developing countries being effectively put across in negotiations and the need for it to move to the UN. If you just look at one of the core demands, which is also on point 2 on tax incentives, which you had made, really the core demand is the rule order, who gets the money first from the global minimum tax. And one of the points which developing countries are also fighting for right now in the inclusive framework is that the subject to tax rule should be treated something as a minimum standard so that it's implemented for sure, because there's also a lack of trust, because if you look at the number of BEPS provisions which have been implemented, they're not that many. Even the minimum standards are not been that widely implemented. So the subject to tax rule is also to be treated as a minimum standard so that for sure it's implemented into double tax treaties. I mean, that won't really increase the chances, but it would be better than not giving it that special status. So that was the only point I wanted to add.
Thank you so much, Abdul. And then the final comment to Marlene, and then I will close the session.
Thank you, Irma. I'm just reiterating some of what has been said by previous speakers, but from a developing countries standpoint, I think that what developing countries really want is we want to be able to improve our domestic resource mobilization. And I think that the fiscal rules can assist by revisions to the global tax rules to make them simpler, more administrable, more balanced, and a fairer allocation of taxing rights. I think that developing countries would also appreciate increased efforts to help us to build our technical capacity. Those are what I think the what I think developing countries would be very appreciative of. And so whereas we are supportive, well, I speak on behalf of Jamaica, we are supportive of the efforts being made to, or the discussion surrounding leveling the playing field. Efforts have been made to build technical capacity and so on. I think ultimately a fairer tax system is what would ultimately help developing countries. So I just wanted to make that final point.
Thank you so much. We want to do two things just to wrap up. First of all, and second of all, we would like to take a picture because of privacy reasons. And in case that you don't want to be in the picture, then please just put your camera off so that you are not in the picture. So I will say first the picture and then after the wrap up. So then it gives some time to just discuss and for us to process everything. We just take the picture and we just say 1, 2, 3, so then it works. Juliana, you know how to do it. I don't, but anyways, it seems like now we are kind of changing completely the topic, but we will go back to the wrap up of the session. So 1, 2, 3. Juliana, you got it? Great. So I think that, thanks. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating, also for the lively discussion in the chat. It's 6 minutes to 4, and we try to finish on time. It seems like, I was thinking at the beginning, 2 hours will be very little, and it is indeed. There is a lot of things to be discussed. What is interesting to see is that you see from different perspectives, but still is not clear, and there is no one solution fits all, but also at the same time, the role of the OECD and the UN always come into mind, but also the new challenges from the having this, the US, the GLOBE, and what the developing countries of the lower income countries can do. So the idea of this GLOBTAXGOV was to bring just today a forum for discussion. And we may continue because we have a lot of events this year. I think that there are 3 takeaways of this. First of all, we need to have this sort of discussions. We need to involve the developing countries. We need to involve academia, civil society, think tanks, etc., governments. And at the same time, we also do not, there are different views, but that doesn't mean that we cannot share those views. And I think that this is the main lesson of today. Thank you so much also to Scott, to Suranjali, and to Steve, because they were behind also trying to help me to prepare in terms of the statement. So thank you so much for helping me with this. And thank you to all the roundtable participants, also everyone who participated and brought the spice here. I mean, Alison as well, bringing the spices to this. And of course, Peter Hogler was very spicy. Thank you, everyone. And at the same time, thank you to all the public in general. So it's 4 minutes to 4. Thank you so much. And we will have a recording of this, so it will be available for everyone. And we will make sure that you have access to the recording. Thank you. Have a nice day. Bye.